They told J.D. Vance to leave. His reaction left the entire diner speechless. No one was ready for what he would say. They thought he'd get angry, maybe even make a scene. Instead, what J.D. Vance did next left the entire diner in stunned silence. It was just another evening. J.D. Vance pulled into the lot of Owen's Diner, a modest little joint in the center of Springfield, Ohio. It wasn't flashy, just one of those quintessential American diners that had survived the decades. The neon sign over the door flickered softly, whining into the evening darkness. With each swing of the door, the homey aroma of grilled burgers and newly brewed coffee drifted out, calling in hungry customers. He had heard about this diner earlier in the day from a local man who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut French fries. After a long, exhausting day of meetings, policy discussion and handshakes, all J.D. craved was a peaceful meal before driving back the long distance. What he walked into was anything but welcoming. The moment he walked in, the little silver bell above the door clanged, alerting everyone to his arrival. The atmosphere was cozy and retro-looking, booths of faces he recognized as probably having been here for years. A wall at the back of the counter had yellowed Polaroid photographs, reminders of decades of workers and patrons. The air reeked with bacon grease, coffee and fried food. For a moment, J.D. believed that he had discovered the perfect spot to unwind. And then everything turned around. Behind the counter, J.D. noticed the hostess type there. She was smiling, already in mid-smile actually, customer service mechanisms kicking in like a habit. Then, before he even could blink, she changed expressions across her entire face. It wasn't significant, just a flutter, a delay, but it registered on him. Her mouth clamped itself into a tightly drawn-out uncertainty. A man, half a burger in his mouth, paused mid-bite, leaned forward towards the man sitting opposite him, and muttered something under his breath. Another customer, a woman with a flannel shirt, put her coffee cup down a bit too abruptly on the table, the soft clink ringing out too loudly. She locked eyes with J.D., her eyes just slightly narrowing before she looked away. He was not unaware. He knew exactly what was happening. But then what did he do? No one expected it. J.D. Vance walked into a diner. They told him to leave. What he did next? No one expected. J.D. Vance had been in enough rooms to recognize when he wasn't exactly welcome. He could feel it in the air, the small shifts, the sidelong looks, the unspoken tension that wrapped around the room like an invisible fog. But this, a simple diner in the middle of Ohio, he hadn't expected that. The hostess blinked, then stepped forward a little way, pushing a strand of escaped hair behind her ear. Good evening, she said, modulating carefully. Eating in or picking up? J.D. brought out a small, tired laugh. Eating in, if that's all right. Another pause. Too long a pause. For such a straightforward question, the answer should have been immediate. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, toward the kitchen, toward someone else, before returning to him. I have to check something real quick, just one moment. And then she was gone, disappearing through the swinging doors. J.D. waited there, the weight of a few pairs of eyes turning in his direction. A man at the counter fidgeted, shifting himself as if he'd just become all of a sudden uncomfortable. Another person, he couldn't quite determine who, grumbled something to themselves. Something was wrong. In the kitchen, voices came and went. J.D. couldn't make out the words, but the whispers, the urgent tones in their voices spoke volumes to him. He took a slow breath. No, he was not going to freak out. He was not going to assume. Maybe it was just policy. Maybe they had staffed low. Maybe. The hostess returned. No second-guessing this time. Her voice was resolute. Her decision was final. I apologize, sir. We can't serve you tonight. J.D. sat in silence for a moment. The words suspended in the air, heavy and motionless, the weight of them pressing down on the room so you couldn't even look away. This wasn't business. This was personal. The diner never did fall quiet, but it could have. In the background, the grill crackled, a fork scraped against a plate somewhere. But the low hum of conversation? Gone. People were watching, waiting. What would he do next? What happened next would leave everyone stunned. They did not expect J.D. Vance to get angry. What he said shut down the whole diner. J.D. Vance stared fixedly at the face of the hostess. She was not angry. She was not agitated, only stern, one who had already made up their mind. Or worse, someone else had, for her. His gaze went over her, to the small window that gave onto the kitchen. In the background, two cooks stood half hidden behind a heat lamp laden with plates. Neither of them moved. Their faces were hollow, unyielding. J.D. coughed. "Sorry, did I do something wrong?" This time the hostess did not squirm. She did not mumble. Her response was brief, too brief. "It's just, we'd rather not serve you this evening." No apology, no fake politeness, no, "We're closing soon." Just that. J.D. exhaled, his hands dropping to his hips. He'd had his fair share of uncomfortable moments in the past. Tense political discussions, interview sessions tailored to catch him on the fly, moments in which words as weapons were leveled against him. But this, being turned away by a plain roadside cafe, there was something to that. Something which stung more than he expected. A cough broke the tension. J.D. moved a little, catching the attention of an older man sitting at the counter. The man was the type who'd been around for decades. His blue work shirt was frayed at the cuffs, his hands tough and knotted from years of hard labor. The man shook his head, more to himself than to anyone, before spearing the final of his eggs. A few booths down, a woman adjusted in her seat, her expression inscrutable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back, arms folded. A smirk danced at the edge of his mouth, as if he was relishing the show. J.D. took it all in, the glances that darted away the moment they caught his, the ones that lingered too long, and the ones that said something else altogether, something sharp. Satisfaction. The weight of the moment came down on him. He had options. He might have spun around, walked out the door, shaken his head and let it go. But that wasn't what happened next. He could have called them out, but what he did instead left everyone stunned. J.D. Vance had options. He could have requested an explanation. He could call them out, put them on the spot, and ask if they had any idea what this would be like when the morning news cycle picked it up. He could challenge them directly, see how firm they were once they caught a glimpse of the reality that they were denying service to a sitting U.S. senator. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he simply nodded, his voice calm, firm, composed. "Okay," he said, "I want to speak to the manager." The room adjusted. The request surprised some of the individuals. The hostess paused again, glancing toward the kitchen as if waiting for silent approval. At the counter, the elderly man muttered to himself. Over by the window, someone let out a short, incredulous laugh, like they couldn't believe he actually was doing that. J.D. didn't react. He just stood there, waiting. The hostess disappeared behind another door. A few beats of quiet went on. A sip of coffee, a plate gliding across the counter, the muted clatter of silverware. Then, the door opened. A man stepped out, early 50s, broad shoulders, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read, Don. And Don didn't ask J.D. what he wanted. He didn't say hello. He just sized him up once and said, "I hear you got a question." Not welcoming, not even courteous. It was a test. J.D. held firm, steady, expressionless. He wasn't at the diner to debate. He wasn't at the diner to flex his muscles. But he wasn't going to get up from that diner without an explanation either. He held firm. "Yeah," J.D. said, "I'd like to know why you refused to serve me." Don exhaled through his nose with some force, like he'd been waiting for the query all this while. This ain't personal. But J.D. knew better. Don was in no hurry to respond. Instead, he dried his hands on his apron, shooting a glance at the customers still staring at the scene. Some pretended not to have heard. Others, they didn't bother hiding their interest. "Look," Don said at last, shifting his weight, "this ain't personal." J.D.'s eyebrows shot up. "Looks pretty personal." Don's jaw gripped. He massaged the back of his neck as though he was trying to get through something he didn't want to say. Then with a sigh, he finally admitted it. "Folks around here made assumptions about you, about what you stand for. I have a business to run, and I don't want any trouble." J.D. nodded slowly, letting the words hang there. "And me having a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. His eyes flashed toward the counter, where the elderly man in the worn work shirt went back to his eggs. chewing just a little more slowly now. A booth or two away, the younger guy sat with arms crossed, looking like this was the highlight of his week so far. JD had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. It wasn't just one choice. It was what that choice meant, how it would be, how the others would be. It was about the ripple effect, the silent pressure, the unwritten expectations that might push someone into making decisions they weren't even sure about. JD's glare was pointed at Don. "Tell me the truth," he said to him, his voice firm. "Do you feel this way about it, or is this something you're doing to keep the peace?" For the first time, JD saw it. Hesitation. Don's fingers curled slightly against his apron, and for just a second something flickered across his face. It almost looked like discomfort. Like maybe, just maybe, Don wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to seem, but before he could answer, a sharp laugh cut through the diner. "Oh, come on." The younger guy in the booth shook his head, smirking. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." JD turned to him, studied him. The man wore the face of a man who enjoyed a good fight, the kind of man who had been itching for an excuse to open his mouth. And now he had one. "Then let's talk." JD didn't take the bait. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Don, his voice even. "I've got no problem leaving, if that's really what you want." The words lingered, providing Don with an opening, a chance to catch his breath, to reconsider, to hold his ground against whatever coercion had gotten them this far. For an instant, JD believed he could. Don's gaze flashed across the kitchen, then snapped back at him. He hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, finally, he growled, "I just don't want things to get dirty." JD nodded. "Neither do I." And for an extended period of time, neither one of them said a word. JD might have left. He might have shook his head, stood up, and walked away. He might have picked up his phone, called someone, made this into an article, let the internet magic happen. But instead, he did something nobody was expecting. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Then let's talk." The room became tight. JD didn't slam down the chair. He didn't puff out his chest or yell at the top of his lungs. He simply sat, purposefully, silently, resting his arms on the table, as if he had all the time in the world. The diner was not used to this. Confrontations usually got quickly settled, with one side walking out or shutting down. But this was not that. Don glared at JD for what felt like a very long time. Then slowly, he let out a breath. "Talk?" he said again, as if the term itself did not have a place. JD shrugged. "You don't want me here, I get that. What I don't get is why. So let's talk about it." A derisive snicker from the younger man in the booth. "Man, this guy's got balls." JD feigned not hearing him. Don pulled back the chair in front of JD, but didn't sit. Instead, he leaned on it, his arms resting on the back. He still wore the apron covered in flour powder, and for the first time, it appeared as though, perhaps, just perhaps, he was not quite so sure about all this anymore. "What do you want me to say?" Don's apron remained dusted with flour, the kind of wear that would tell you he'd been working here since morning shift. He folded his arms across his chest, shaking his head. "I run a business," he said finally. "I do not get into altercations. I do not need headlines, but I have a community to think of." JD nodded. "Okay. So what does this community think of me?" Don paused. For a moment, he looked like he was going to wait for someone else to answer that question. At the counter, the waitress shifted positions uncomfortably. The man in the old work jacket was sitting down, his fork raised above the plate, but not eating for quite some time now. Then Don exhaled. "Folks around here don't care about presidents. Don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for, it doesn't sit right with people." JD leaned back slightly. "Okay, but you don't know me, do you?" Don hesitated. "Not personally, no." JD held him for a beat, and then said, "Tell me this. If I was just some dude walking into here, not some guy who you've watched on TV, would we be having this conversation?" Silence. JD stood there in silence. He saw something give on Don's face, not a breakthrough, not yet, but something cracked a little, and then A mocking snort from the rear of the room. The guy in the booth smiled and shook his head. "This has nothing to do with TV, man. This has to do with people having an idea about who you truly are." JD whirled back to look at him, even in tone. "And what am I?" The man beamed. Finally, the accolades he'd craved so badly. "You're the person who acts as though you understand common people. Then you act out politics just like everyone else." JD considered thoughtfully taking that on. "Fine," he said. "Then tell me, what do you think I could have done better?" For the first time, the guy flinched. That wasn't what he had expected. JD didn't prod. "You want me to leave? Fine. But you're on. Say what you've got to say." The diner was quiet now. Even the kitchen had dropped silent. No clinking dishes, no orders being shouted, just the dense quiet of a room holding its breath. Don sighed, raking the back of his neck. "This ain't what I expected tonight." JD allowed a small, weathered smile to cross his face. "Me neither." Something was shifting. For the first time, tension wasn't just about division. It was different. Something closer to understanding. Even individuals who had played stupid didn't so much as think about taking another bite, having their eyes dart over the table. JD remained calm, waiting. The younger guy leaned back in his booth, arms crossed, but now there was hesitation in his face. Maybe because he realized JD wasn't arguing, he wasn't defending himself, he was just listening. Don finally let out a breath, gripping the chair in front of him. "You want to know what people think?" He shook his head. "They think you're full of it." JD didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just cocked his head like he was really considering the words. Don blew out through his nose. "They think you write about working-class individuals, but you play along too. That you offer promises like all the other guys in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing's changed. And they don't forget." JD nodded slowly. "I see what you mean." A scoff. The young man in the booth shook his head. "That's it? That's all you're gonna say?" He glared at him, eyes determined. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened up in his seat. For the first time, he didn't look so certain. "Just a guy looking for a meal. You're supposed to argue." The younger man in the booth hunched forward now, arms no longer crossed. "Defend yourself. Say something." JD rested his forearms on the table, fingers loosely entwined. "Your mind was made up about me before you ever walked through that door." The man's mouth opened a fraction, but nothing emerged. "You wanted me to lose my temper," JD went on, his tone even. "Wanted me to hit back so you could be vindicated." Nothing. JD waited for a moment before he continued. "But suppose I told you, I know exactly what that anger feels like." He faced Don again. "You told me nothing ever changed. I know that. I was raised with it. I watched other people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt abandoned. And sure, I went to school, did things nobody ever expected me to do, but that doesn't mean I forgot." Don's fingers tapped absently against the chair. His face was inscrutable, but he didn't look dismissive. He looked contemplative. JD gazed around the diner, his voice firm but unshakable. "You don't have to agree. I'm not visiting here to try to shape your views. I came in here as a patron, not as an office hunter, just some fella needing a sandwich." Silence. And then from behind the counter, a rumbling growl of indignation. "Damn shame when a fella can't even have a burger." The old man in the work shirt did not even look up, just shook his head and prodded at his eggs. The tension broke, and just a little. Some folks snickered. Even Don let out a small laugh, shaking his head. JD glared back at him. "So, what now?" Don let out a sigh, rubbing his hand over his face. His eyes darted over to the kitchen, where the cooks remained standing there, staring. Over to JD again. Finally he sighed. "I'll tell you what." He leaned in, resting the back of the chair. "You stay here and finish this conversation, and if at the end of it I don't think you're just another guy blowing smoke, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress take you a menu." JD nodded, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Sounds like a deal." For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else, something more like a conversation. The mood in the diner had changed. The tension in Don's shoulders eased, barely. The younger man in the booth lost the smirk, sitting up now instead of leaning back like this was some kind of show. Even the customers who had sat there silently, who had simply observed from the periphery, appeared, less assured in their own opinions. Perhaps this wasn't political anymore. Perhaps, if only for a night, this was all about listening. A seat at the table. JD leaned slightly. "All right," he answered, voice tempered. "Let's finish this conversation." Don exhaled a breath and slumped into the chair across from him. He was tired. Not the tired that comes from a long run. The tired that settles deep within a person. The weight of years, of expectation, of feeling like the world isn't listening. "I'll tell you the truth," said Don, scratching his hands together. "I don't know if you're the kind of guy people make you out to be. I don't know if you're really looking out for guys like us, or if you're just a big talker." JD nodded. Don appraised him. "What I do know is that around here people have long memories. They remember every promise ever made to them. Every time someone shook their hand, looked them in the eye, and said they'd do something, and then turned around and never came back." JD tapped a knuckle on the table, weighing it. Then he said, "I don't blame them for that." Don snorted a laugh, shaking his head. "That's the problem. Nobody ever does." A beat passed. Then, from behind the counter, the man in the work jacket said again. His tone was assertive, but there was something heavy under it. "I worked 35 years in a factory, 35 damn years." He set his coffee down softly. "Watched my neighbors lose their work. Watched families leave and move away because there was nothing more for them to do. Watched politicians arrive, shake hands, tell us they got it, then drive away back to wherever the devil they're from." JD met his stare. "And you think I'm one of them politicians?" The old man stared at him for a very, very long time, then shrugged. "I don't know, but I can tell you this." He pointed with a calloused finger in the direction of JD. "You're the only one who stuck around to listen to me." That struck a chord. The counter waitress shifted, glancing over at Don. The two cooks in the kitchen looked at each other. Even the young guy in the booth, who had been the most vocal critic, was suddenly speechless. JD let the silence hang, then turned back to Don. "So, what's it gonna be?" Don drummed his fingers on the table, looked toward the kitchen, breathed out again, then got up. "Mary," he called over the counter, "get him a menu." A shiver of surprise ran through the diner. The younger man let out a snort, but he didn't protest. The waitress, Mary, paused for a fraction of a second before picking up a laminated menu and bringing it over. JD took it from her with a minimal nod. "Appreciate it." Don shook his head, half wonder, half skepticism. "I still don't know if I like you." JD grinned, opening the menu. "That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me." Don chuckled softly, then addressed the kitchen. "All right, boys, fire up the grill." And with that, what had been refusal was something no one in that diner would ever forget. The tension had passed, not completely, but enough. Enough for the clinking of forks against plates to resume. Enough for the low hum of conversation to slowly reassemble itself. JD sat in the booth, menu in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching Don, watching the old man at the counter, watching the younger man in the booth who was still skeptical, but no longer smirking. Mary, the waitress, filled him a cup of coffee without saying a word. He nodded thanks. And for the first time that night, he didn't think like a politician. He simply thought like a man getting ready to sit down to dinner. "Regret's a curious thing," the old man grouched, his voice rough from years of cigarette smoke and dawn awakenings. "Most the time, it ain't what we did, it's what we didn't do." JD glanced over, noticing the old man spooning his coffee gradually, purposefully. His spoon clattered against the ceramic, the sound small but persistent. Don shook his head, his expression wry. "Hell, Earl, you always have to make everything so deep." Earl shrugged. "Man's gotta entertain himself somehow." A small snicker went around the diner. Even Don smiled faintly before rubbing his jaw, his expression falling back to something thoughtful. "You know," Don said to him, looking JD over again over his shoulder, "I still don't know what to make of you." JD put his cup down and took another swallow of coffee, the bitterness on the roof of his mouth. "That's okay. I guess most people don't, initially." Don studied him for another interminable moment, then finally shook his head. "Well, since you're here, you might as well order something. Kitchen's already on." JD unfolded the menu, reading it. What do you recommend? Don snorted a dry laugh. Depends. You want something to wake you up or something to knock you out? JD smiled. Guess we'll see. The waitress, Mary, lingered by the counter, waiting, pen clicking against her notepad. And for the first time that night, the diner didn't feel like a war zone. It just felt like somewhere a man could sit, drink his coffee, and maybe, just maybe, be heard. This reads like the perfect blend of storytelling and engagement, strong, thoughtful, and having a natural flow that invites the reader in. It's got that old-fashioned, small-town tension, but instead of the usual shouting match, it leans towards something less typical, patience and understanding. That the JD reacts thus, choosing to hear him out instead of striking back, has resonance because it's unexpected. And the last sentence of that, wanting the listener to think of their own life, that makes them remember the story. You're doing a great job on this if it's for video or blog, though. Are you looking for tone, pace, or phrasing adjustments around the call to action?